Everything astonished Jose Martí in the United States. His copious accounts are a primary source for the study of a decade of life in the U.S., not only of the transition from a more or less peaceful application of the Monroe Doctrine to active and militarily aggressive imperialism, but also and mainly about everyday matters and national events, the trial of President Garfield's assassin, the inauguration of President Cleveland, the trousseau of his fiancée, the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge, the bustle of a Sunday at Coney Island, the fashions of Fifth Avenue, diversions, dances, sleigh rides, regattas, boxing matches, baseball games, the crimes and criminals of New York, the death of Jesse James, the wonderful bouillabaisse served by Madame Turrell in Hanover Square, which was then the center of the financial district, art exhibitions, opening of plays, details of the Oklahoma land boom, and the wars out west against the Sioux. Martí saw the faults and virtues of the Colossus of the North, and he saw the dangers for Latin America. The overwhelming emphasis on money did not seem to him, quote, a sound basis for a nation, this exclusive love, vehement and uneasy for material fortune, that ruins people here, or polishes them only on one side, giving them the appearance of being simultaneously colossi and children, end quote. And stemming from these values, open quote, a cluster of avaricious thinkers yearn for expansion at the cost of the territories of what Martí called our America. Certainly it seemed to him that it was a deeply painful thing to see a turtle dove die at the hands of an ogre. But one should not confuse the circle of ultra-aguilistas with the thought of what he called a heterogeneous, hard-working conservative people occupied with itself and because of these same varied strengths well-balanced. And faced with the cultural inertia of Spain in America, Martí felt an urgent need to explain the United States. As he said, to bring into the light all its magnificent qualities and to highlight with all its positive strengths this splendid struggle of men. And that is from Redeemers, originally published as Redentores, Ideas and Power in Latin America by Enrique Krauze, 2011. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is the Western Front.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Front podcast. My name is Melissa Ford, and I'm the director of Western Hemisphere at the America First Policy Institute, and I am joined by Joshua Treviño, senior advisor to the president and senior fellow for the Western Hemisphere Initiative here at AFPI, as well as chief transformation officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you, Josh, for making us all look like underachievers, and thank you for being here today.
Not at all. I've only achieved what I've achieved because of your partnership, Melissa, and I want to welcome those who knew us from the hard country back in the day at TPPF. Now we have a bigger canvas to play with.
We do, and I do want us to jump into the Western Hemisphere Initiative, but I want to give you the opportunity first to talk about the passage that you just read and tell us why you chose it, why it's important.
You know, Enrique Krauze, who you and I have had the pleasure of meeting in Mexico City, is, to my mind, the most eminent living Mexican intellectual today, and arguably one of the most eminent living Latin American intellectuals today, a man of profound depth and humanity. Even when we disagree on policy, which happens a lot, actually, I think I would characterize him as a man of the left. Would you disagree with that, by the way?
No, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, fairly so. But a left that is in eclipse now, a humane left, a left that one could live with in civil society. And I think that's the tendency that Krauze represents. His son, Leon, is also very active now in the commentariat. But to your question, the reason that I read that particular passage was twofold. One is that what Martí, you know, who's the hero of Cuban independence, building Cuban nationhood in this era of the late 19th century, what he is experiencing and presaging is really what the intellectual and cultural life of Latin America has to contend with after the shock of 1898. And of course, in 1898, the Americans expel the Spanish Empire from the Western Hemisphere, where it had been for 500 years prior to. And so that was a terrific shock, and it was also a spur for Latin America, this generation of 98, which you saw in Spain and also in the Western Hemisphere in some different ways, to really start to think and assess what its relationship was, not just to the United States, but also to itself. You know, what kind of nation is getting built in these Spanish-speaking republics? And that's a question that was initially asked during the independence era from kind of 1810 to 1830. It gets asked again a century later. It's still being asked today. It's something that I think we'll talk about on the show as we move forward. And then the second reason that I read the passage is actually the book itself is worth contending with, and so I'll hold it up here for the camera. But it's Redeemers. When it came out in 2011, it was actually the first Krauze work that I had read, and I was struck by its intent and structure. It's modeled on Plutarch's Parallel Lives. I think he says in the introduction that the shadow of Plutarch comes over the book, which is something that only a man like Krauze could say without seeming arrogant. But in his case, it works because he actually is a true intellectual. And then the other reason it's useful is that focusing upon these lives and kind of the dreamland, the fantasy land that has characterized so much of Latin American ideology and politics since the inception is well worth the exploration. So I do recommend the book, and I think it is a great launching point to the topics that we're going to cover in the Western Front.
Yeah, I think you picked the perfect passage. And I do want us to jump into the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine. I think you and I were talking about it, as I would say, like back before it was cool, years ago. And now I'm hearing it in all sorts of conversations, not just policy conversations, but social media, normal people conversations. And it's become, a very common phrase in DC right now. And so I want us to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. But first, I want us to talk about our Western Hemisphere initiative, because the idea of the U.S. reasserting its primacy over the entire Western Hemisphere is one of our main policy goals or policy priorities. I know that back when we were recording Hard Country, we really only talked about U.S. Mexico. Every once in a while, we would throw in a little bit of other Western Hemisphere affairs that were going on. But it was really the focus back then because we were in Texas and we had a very different government, right? We were focused on survival. But now we're able to expand our scope a little bit to the entire Western Hemisphere. And we have a new president, right? We have a new president who realizes that we have neglected the Western Hemisphere and Latin America for way too long, and a new president that wants to change that. So there's this movement to kind of reassert our primacy over the Western Hemisphere. And there's been this awakening that we have ceded our Western Hemisphere to powers that aren't friendly to us. We've allowed the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians to develop this very strong footprint in the Western Hemisphere, and there's a desire and an appetite for that to change. So I wanted to tell you, this morning I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal called Trump's Monroe Doctrine aims to dominate the Americas. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, Josh. I want to ask you, why the Monroe Doctrine, and why now in the Western Hemisphere? What are the threats, or what are the reasons that make this Monroe Doctrine posture relevant again?
Yeah, great question. And of course, you and I did that celebratory show on the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine back in the day. It seems like a million years ago, wasn't it? It's December 2024, I think. I'll have to go check that.
I think it was longer than that.
Maybe longer than that. Yeah, time is compressed, especially since Trump is back. The article that you found in the Wall Street Journal, and we'll post it in the show description. It's well worth reading. I'm glad you highlighted it, because when you sent it, I went through and realized it was that rarity. It was a news analysis piece that actually betrayed an understanding of what's happening. Look, to go back to what the Monroe Doctrine originally was and what it was intended to do, the Monroe Doctrine fundamentally was an expression of American rejection of European colonization in the Americas. And there wasn't an effort to seize the remaining European colonies, because obviously, like, the British had Jamaica and Spain still had Cuba and so on, and obviously the French had their territories. The French still have a territory in French Guiana in South America, along with, I think, a handful of islands. But it was drawing a line, and in drawing the line, there was an implicit assertion in the Monroe Doctrine that the United States had the power and the interest to enforce that line. And in fact, as evolved over the course of the 19th century, we developed that capacity. It's inarguable that when the Monroe Doctrine was asserted, that we really didn't have the ability to adjudicate in quite that way. The French obviously conquered Mexico in the 1860s. Now, we were distracted then, but nevertheless, it was an adventure that sort of gestured toward then the pragmatic impotence of the Monroe Doctrine. None of that was true 30 years later, though. When you get into the 1890s, the United States is actually able to impose its will upon European powers in the Western Hemisphere in ways that are decisive and inarguable. I think of some of the conflicts about the Venezuelan boundaries, and actually Venezuela comes up twice, I think, with regard to the Germans and the British in the latter years of the 19th century. And what that ends up becoming is a hegemonic position. But we have to explain what that hegemony, actually means. I mean, one thing, when you think about Alexander Micabaritze's thesis that the independence of the Spanish republics end up dropping them off the chessboard of history. That's a paraphrase of what he says. That is only made possible because of the Monroe Doctrine. When you think about the reality that none of the independent nations of the Americas were ever recolonized, with one exception, which is the Dominican Republic, which invited the Spanish back for a while, little known fact. That is possible because of the Monroe Doctrine. So the reason that South America, Central America, and so on don't get torn to pieces like, say, Southeast Asia or Africa in the age of colonization is because of the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine, as you well know, because we've seen it, Melissa, kind of has a bad name throughout a lot of Latin America. But I would encourage our Latin American friends to reconsider a bit. And that's not to excuse every single thing the United States has done, but to realize that the alternative to it across 200 years would have been the Germans or the French or perhaps the Russians descending upon some point in Latin America and making it their own. And I think it's inarguable that would have been a far worse outcome. There's more to say, but I'll stop there. Please let me know what I didn't hit.
Well, I think one thing that I want to talk about is, obviously, we know that President Trump is focused and interested in the interests of the United States.
Yeah.
But I think something that's worth clarifying is that what we believe, Josh, is I think those interests are deeply aligned with the interests of a lot of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. And President Trump acknowledges that he cares about, right, America first, and that the reason that now there's so much interest in Latin America is because he's smart. He's realized that a lot of the issues that we've had in South American countries, whether that be organized crime, economic collapse, authoritarian regimes, drugs, they show up at our doorstep. They show up at our southern border sooner or later, right? And I think that also why Latin America matters, it's because of geography. I mean, they're right next door. They're our neighbors. And so that proximity matters a lot. Also to them. It matters to us because we feel the repercussions, but it also matters to them because when the U.S. falters, they all feel it. So I also wanted to touch on one thing because kind of going back to the article that I mentioned a little while ago, there seems to be this perception that there's this new Monroe Doctrine, right? So that Trump might be fighting the hemisphere instead of fighting for the hemisphere. I noticed a line towards the beginning that says, where the Monroe Doctrine sought to keep European powers out of the region, Trump has turned that doctrine inward. So the paragraph kind of goes on to talk about how maybe Trump is using that in his favor to reward loyalty and maybe to punish people that are defiant to him. So I wanted to touch on that. What do you think, or what would you say to people that think that Trump is invoking this Monroe Doctrine because he wants to treat the U.S. or the Western Hemisphere as an extension of the U.S.?
Yeah, great question. Look, the Monroe Doctrine I think it's 1904 receives what's called the Roosevelt Corollary, and the Roosevelt Corollary essentially says that if there is an ungoverned space, this is my paraphrase, not Theodore Roosevelt's, if there's an ungoverned space in the hemisphere, or if there's misgovernance or malgovernance in the hemisphere, that if the local state or power holders or local sovereigns don't step in, the United States will, and in fact the United States must, specifically because, exactly to your point, and I think the president understands this as well, if we don't do it, then that disorder and that criminality inevitably spreads and it hits American communities and homes. And so that's it. Again, this is unpopular, right? So the Roosevelt Corollary and the Monroe Doctrine end up getting formally disavowed during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, which inaugurates what's called the good neighbor policy. And it never really goes away. But I would say this is the first time, like right now in 2025, this is the first time in a little over a century that it's been so that the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary have been so explicitly invoked. Now, to your question, is this just cover for the United States to dictate what's happening in the hemisphere? No, I don't think so. Honestly, there's no question. And when you talk to the policymakers involved, as you and I both have, there's not unanimity on a lot, but there's unanimity on one big thing, which is that if our sister republics in the hemisphere would handle things themselves, we'd be happy not to. But the reality is that they don't in many cases. Some of them do, some of them don't. I mean, there's good regimes and bad regimes. You see regimes like the one in Ecuador, for example, under Noboa, in Argentina, trying to do the right thing. Not just them, but these are examples. The Panamanians, trying to do the right thing by leaving the Chinese Belt and Road and so on. And so, not that any of these are perfect, but they're directionally oriented in the correct way, which we appreciate, see, and reward. But on the other hand, you have a lot of regimes that are frankly narco regimes. And this is what's arisen, particularly over the past 40, 50 years of American neglect of the region. And so we have regimes in the hemisphere that are governed by what we have described in our research and our public commentary as essentially narco-state syntheses. And by the way, when I say narcos, I don't mean, that's a colloquialism. They don't just traffic in drugs; they traffic in humans, they traffic in stolen goods, they traffic in and they liaise with terror organizations around the world. And so these are 360 comprehensive criminal organizations. But their embeddedness in the state and their alliance with the state has become a model of governance in itself. And so you look at what I would describe as estados de narco, across the region, governments, regimes that are characterized by the synthesis of the state and the narco at the same time. You're obviously talking about the Cuban regime, 100%. You're clearly talking about the Venezuelan regime, no question about it. And although there's change at the edges, you are talking about the Mexican regime as well. And so you see this over and over and over. And the question is, how do we deal with it? Now, I know we're going to talk about the case of Venezuela in a moment, but the Trump administration understands very clearly, and I think admirably, that this is a situation that is long-term intolerable. It was a situation that the Biden administration was prepared to tolerate. It's not something that we can, and that's in keeping with the traditional American approach to the region. When you look at the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, for example, which, appropriately enough was entitled Operation Just Cause, well, it was a just cause, and it was a just cause because the regime, the illegitimate regime of General Manuel Noriega, was one of these estados de narco. And so, it was beyond the ability of Panamanian civil society to correct it, so the United States had to step in and do so. And I think it's indisputable for any honest observer, inside or outside Panama, that Panama is better off for it. The same is going to apply when the Venezuelan regime falls, when the Cuban regime, God willing, falls. And then I think Mexico is something qualitatively different. Our goal for it is not to fall, but to perform. But all this is to say that when you look at the logical end state of this, it's actually not the United States running the hemisphere. Because when Venezuela has a free, democratic, strong, and sovereign government, when Mexico no longer has an estado de narco of its own, when the Cuban people are free, then the rationale for an aggressive American presence, and certainly military presence, goes away. And in that case, you actually see a fulfillment of, I think, the vision of Jose Martí and a variety of other classical Latin American liberals, in which Latin America, as part of the hemisphere, is free, strong, and peaceful. And that's the actual end that we want. To get there, though, is going to require American power.
Right. And since you brought up Venezuela, let's stay on that topic. Let's elaborate a little bit on it. I know a lot of people have been asking us about it. A lot of people are curious about what's going to happen. But we're already seeing the Monroe Doctrine in action. We've been seeing it every day. And if we look down south, if we look to Venezuela, we have seen President Trump mount the largest military buildup that the region has seen in decades. And so just to summarize it, we are 8 weeks in the Caribbean. We're 8 weeks into a campaign with two aims, I would say. The first one is stopping drugs. And then the second one, many think, is putting pressure on Maduro or an aim of toppling Maduro. That's what a lot of people are saying, right? So our military have killed at least 32 people in 7 different strikes off the coast of Venezuela. And last week, Trump confirmed that he's authorized CIA covert operations on Venezuelan soil. So why is he doing this, Josh? What is the objective? Is he trying to send a message? What's the relevance of all of this for us?
One thing I'll add is that it's not just the Caribbean anymore. Within the past 24 hours of this recording, we've actually struck a boat, one of the Go Fast boats, off of the coast of Colombia and the Pacific Ocean as well. So it is it's a two ocean approach at this point, but it's for the good. Interdicting those sea lanes is a necessary step. Obviously, there's sea, air, and land, and our strength is best applied in the sea and the air. And I think any American should be glad that the Trump administration is doing this, taking action that we were assured by generations of policymakers was functionally impossible to do. Well, it turns out you can just do things, and one of the things that you can do is sink narco boats on the high seas. God bless the White House for being willing to do it. Look, you're asking about the ultimate aim of all this, and multiple things can be true at once. And I'll share with the listeners here, the viewers here, that I don't have any information that's not in the public domain already. So I want to give analysis that doesn't descend too far into mind reading. Anybody who tells you that they know what the aim of the policy is, if they're not in the government, they don't know. So I'm not going to make that claim. But what I can tell you is what it looks like, and what it looks like is a policy that has a real strategic coherence to it, a real legal and operational justification to it, and one that I think is going to yield some pretty extraordinary results, probably sooner rather than later. 2026 is going to be a big year in the Southern Caribbean. What you see in this is partly the interdiction for its own sake, which is, and you think of everything in the terms of a signaling mechanism. Like, what's the narrative that gets communicated by this? One of the narratives that's communicated is that these cartels, these transnational cartels that have essentially had the best possible deal for years, which is that they could wage war on the United States. And I don't mean that metaphorically, by the way. I mean we have done, this, Melissa, at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we did research demonstrating very clearly that these cartels are involved in an Article 1, Section 10 invasion of the United States. Nevertheless, we treated them with kid gloves because as soon as they're apprehended or spotted or whatever, we adjudicate their fates according to mere criminal law. Well, now they're under a different regime. Now they're under the law of war, which is qualitatively very different, and it puts them on notice that they can no longer expect the favorable treatment that they hitherto received. It's insane to even say that they ever did receive favorable treatment, given the number of Americans they killed, but they did, and that's over. So that's one reason this is happening. Another reason this is happening is that Venezuela itself. So I'll give you three reasons. So reason one is the signaling mechanism of the cartels. Reason number two is going to be the nature of Venezuela itself. It is an estado de narco. It's a narco regime. It's a regime that is a left dictatorship that exists in synthesis with its own criminal cartels, with a lot of support from the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese. It's just a fact. They're there. And so to be able to take that offline, to take that regime offline, is a huge step forward for the hemisphere. You and I have spoken with real security experts, individuals who know the score on what's happening with trafficking of arms, the trafficking of guerrilla networks, and violence and terrorism across the hemisphere, and they are unanimous in saying that the role that used to be occupied by Havana, because Havana used to be the epicenter of all of this bloodshed, is now occupied by Caracas, and so to take that regime off the chessboard in some way, by its nature, is going to be a significant step forward. And then the third reason that it's happening, related to the second, is the effect upon the other estados de narco in the region. I mentioned earlier the Cubans, the Mexicans. I didn't mention the Nicaraguans, although they're in the same they're in the same boat. We've seen this proliferation of these narco regimes, all of which have varying relations with the Chinese and the Russians, and anti-American activities, and synthesis with and profit from cartel activities, and so on. And it's just rampant. I mean, it's everywhere. It sends a message. It sends a message when one of them is taken offline, because it hasn't happened in 4 decades at this point. Again, remember, the last time the United States took one of these regimes off the chessboard was December of 1989. It's been a long time since then, a lot of water under the bridge. To do it to the Venezuelans, if that is in fact the end, which I lean toward the thesis that it is a powerful signal and a powerful deterrent to the Nicaraguans, to the Mexicans, to the Cubans, that they need to shape up, and they need to maybe consider reforming themselves along lines endorsed by the United States. As you know, Melissa, but just to make it very clear to Western Front viewers, since this is literally our first episode, I regard the Mexican regime as problem number one in the region, but I am completely happy to have the focus on Venezuela right now because Venezuela strikes me as prudentially achievable and also maximally signaling to the Mexican state, and so that's what I think is going on. I would look on it as an interlocking series of actions and phenomena that are designed to elicit and result in a multitude of outcomes, all of which are going to be better than the status quo.
Thank you, Josh. I think that's so accurate. And I think Marco Rubio, I don't want to get his quote wrong, but I think he recently said something like killing or blowing up drug boats in the Caribbean that aim to poison and kill Americans is the highest and very best use of our military. So I think that's accurate. But
Yeah.
before we go into U.S. Mexico, which we have to talk about, of course, but
Sure.
before we go into that, I want to ask you one last question. Where do you think that the U.S. will draw the line? Do you think that land strikes are next? What do you foresee?
Well, look again, without indulging in mind reading and acknowledging that I know nothing more than what the average newspaper reader knows. I don't think that we're anywhere close to the prudential limits for American power yet. We have the president's confirmation that CIA activity in Venezuela is authorized. We obviously have this tremendous buildup of forces in the Southern Caribbean. I think it's 10,000 Marines, something like that. It's an MEU plus a lot of aviation that's now suddenly at Roosevelt Roads on the eastern corner of Puerto Rico. That there can be an inference. It's not always true, but there can be an inference that the stuff is there to be used, and the next place to use it would be strikes on Venezuelan soil. So if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would bet on that. But the odds wouldn't be strong; they would be modest.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and jump right into U.S. Mexico affairs. Of course, we have to, Josh. That's how we started our last podcast, The Hard Country. So
Sure.
I feel like it's fair that we talk about it on our very first episode back. So let's just, right off the bat, let's go ahead and say that we're in a very, very different place as far as U.S. Mexico than we were when we started this podcast, I think over 2 years ago at least.
Mm-hmm.
We have new presidents in both countries. And we have a new security chief in Mexico. I mean, we have a new cabinet in the U.S. Right now, the U.S.-Mexico border is quieter than it has been in years. And the Mexican state, as they continue to tell us, has been doing their part to send narcos here, send narcos north for well-deserved justice. And then they're also, the border is also more quiet. They have done their part to help us secure the border. And so there's also an agreement to some sort of security cooperation framework, which a lot is not public about that yet, but it seems like they're making strides in that. So it looks like there has been a lot of progress. We're definitely in a different place than we were. What do you think has changed, Josh? Do you think that all is well in Mexico? Do you think that we're on a good path towards restoring that relationship with them, since now they appear to be cooperating under President Sheinbaum?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the short answer is no. But I need to explain in what way and why I say that. Look, the Trump administration has done what everybody said was impossible. They've shut down the border, and the border is closed. And the Mexicans. Very quickly, yes. Remember when it was supposed to be impossible to prevent tens of thousands of Haitians coming into the United States seeking the blessings of liberty? Well, it turns out that you actually can do that. It's another thing that you can just do is close the border. And so, I give President Trump and the White House full credit for that. And look, President Trump did a great job establishing deterrence vis-a-vis the Mexicans very, very early. It was to the credit of the president and also the Secretary of War Hegseth that they had conversations very early on about unilateral American military strikes inside Mexico. And I think there was a belief that we were serious about that. I hope we were. And that spurred a lot of action too. So the Mexican regime right now is doing its best to buy time. We have to understand that, and they want to achieve two big things. One is they want USMCA, which is the free trade agreement. They want that reauthorized. They don't want to do anything to jeopardize that because they depend upon the income from American trade. And the other thing that they're waiting for, and they'll be incautious and they'll tell you this in private, is they're waiting for the midterms. They think the Democrats are going to come back. I don't agree with that, by the way, but they think the Democrats are going to come back, and then they don't have to worry about Trump as much anymore because it's going to be a Congress that will go after him. Again, I disagree. I actually don't think that's going to be the outcome of the midterms. But all of which is to say is that you see this theme over and over again of they want to do the bare minimum necessary to keep the Trump administration off their back, and that's exactly what they've been doing. But what haven't they done? Like let's accept for the sake of argument that there's robust security cooperation, which I think is a question mark to say the least. But let's say that they have been doing that. What haven't they done? They haven't delivered the politicians who make the narco-state synthesis possible in the first place. And until that happens, they're not serious about change. The Mexicans are completely willing to deliver unlimited numbers of narcos to the United States, pretty much as we demand them. And so they'll load up a plane with 30 or 40 guys to get renditioned out or extradited out to the U.S. But it's never the real hinges of the problem. It's never the individuals who link their office to cartel operations and who make the Mexican state cartel synthesis that we've talked about so often actually real. They're not going to give those guys up because those guys are part of their regime. They're central to the regime, and that's a problem. And we cannot assume that things in Mexico have changed until that happens. Hasn't happened yet. Doesn't look like it's going to happen, and that should be a cause for concern for us. The mistake that we risk making on a policy level is confusing tactical gains, which the Mexicans have delivered, for strategic change, which they have not delivered. Morena, setting aside the cartel partnership that has characterized most of its past 20 years, Morena, which is the Mexican ruling regime, is a deeply leftist, deeply anti-American, deeply authoritarian ideological movement that wants to replace civil society in Mexico with a left populist model and in the long run oriented against the United States. This is not interpretive on my part. It's not a secret. It's not something that's a bit of Gnostic knowledge about Mexican civics. It is something that is well known and publicly proclaimed if you care to read the Morenista literature. And so we do, and we know, and until that issue is solved, until we demand certain civic outcomes from Mexico, which we ought to, your choice is really crisis now or crisis later. Right now, we're having crisis later because we solved the temporary crisis now. But I hope our policymakers understand that the true solution is not yet in sight.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that it's important for us to touch on is, we talked about it a lot in Hard Country, and we talk a lot about now that even under Claudia Sheinbaum, she's taken that talking point, I think, from López Obrador, but they go on and on about intervención, they go on and on about soberanía. Meanwhile, they're carrying out the most interventionist foreign policy of any country in the Western Hemisphere, really of any country at all. And we've talked about how they are lending a lot of aid to illegals and insurrectionaries in American cities, but not even to mention all the things that they're doing here. They are helping prop up the Cuban regime and the Venezuelan regime by sending a lot of aid, by sending a lot of petroleum. And that's just one of many examples of why our bet on Mexico has gone bad the way that we've talked about it. So we thought that the Mexicans would liberalize. We thought that the Mexicans would kind of prove themselves when we negotiated NAFTA back in the day, back in the 80s or 90s. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that bet and why it's gone bad.
Well, right. And this is something that I said at our U.S. Mexico policy conference in Washington, D.C. back on September 23rd, which is that when NAFTA was signed in 1994, America was laying a bet that Mexico would continue to liberalize, that Mexico would be an ally, and that Mexico would be a good faith partner. And none of those bets have come to pass. Actually, all the implicit bets that were laid at NAFTA, 31 years ago, have failed. And so from an empirical basis, we just need to understand that. And I would hope that we would change course. I mean, my fear is that we're going to renegotiate USMCA with no concessions from the Mexicans. And again, I would like to be wrong about that, and hopefully I am. But that renegotiation is happening right now. You mentioned Mexico and its foreign policy. Look, Mexico has the most interventionist foreign policy in the hemisphere, and I'm including the American flotilla in the Southern Caribbean. You're absolutely right. Mexico routinely interferes with law enforcement in the United States. There was a whole New Yorker article about this, about Mexican consulates basically using their facilities and their reach to enable illegals to escape ICE, which is blatant interference in the domestic affairs of the U.S. So they do that. We see Mexican military units crossing the southern border fairly often, actually, usually in protection of drug loads. So there's that violation of U.S. sovereignty. And then look at what they do to the rest of the hemisphere. Melissa, you're from Bolivia. What did they do to Bolivia? Tell me.
They rescued Evo Morales when the Bolivians decided that it was time to hold him accountable.
Yeah. They sent an Air
Yeah,
Force aircraft.
they did, yeah.
Yeah.
Wrote him out of
Yeah.
there like a celebrity so that he wouldn't
Yeah.
have to face justice. And it's not the first or the last time that they've done it.
They rescued a dictator. That's
Yep.
exactly right. You're totally right. They send oil and commodities to the Venezuelans, to the Cubans. Claudia Sheinbaum, the current Mexican president, had an incredibly shameful reaction to the news that Maria Corina Machado had won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh, she did.
She
I
said no
hadn't seen
comment.
that. Oh, that's
Yeah,
it?
yeah, 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 yeah. No comment. No comment. That's all she said. That's all she said. Because of course, she's actively involved in supporting the dictator who is repressing the people of Venezuela that Maria Corina fights, right? And so this is and yet this is a regime that is wants to have free trade with the United States, that wants to be considered a safe partner of the United States. Well, we need to rethink this. Is what I would urge. We didn't even touch the Mexican involvement in the assassination of the Ecuadorian presidential candidate several months back. Over and over and over, what you see constantly is Mexican foreign policy, Mexican intervención, the very thing that they denounce, in the affairs of other hemispheric nations. And the irony of it is, just to kind of put a bow on it, is that since the 1930s, Mexican foreign policy has supposedly been governed by what's been called the Estrada Doctrine. There was a guy named Estrada back in I think the Calles administration, but I could be wrong. One of the early post-revolutionary presidents in Mexico, who essentially said that Mexico's foreign policy would be based on non-intervention and no problems with anybody else in the region. And it's simply not true. It's simply not true. And so one of the things that we need to do from a policy realism standpoint, especially as we think about what the Monroe Doctrine and its application now entails, is realize what the sources of disorder are. Some of the sources of disorder are these estados de narco, these narco-states, but another source of disorder is the Mexican foreign policy and the Mexican habit of intervening on behalf of leftist authoritarians and their narco friends almost throughout Latin America and in the United States.
That's so true, Josh. And I mean, you're absolutely right. We've learned a lot also from the Mexicans in the last couple of years. Obviously, we're seeing what we're seeing now. But through a lot of the things that they have been doing in the last couple of months in an attempt to cooperate, well, maybe to cooperate with us, maybe so that we'll ease up on tariffs, but we've come to realize that a lot of the decisions that they were making, they were choosing to make. Now we've finally seen, now with the border being quiet, we've seen that that could have happened at any point. Now with them choosing to finally send narcos up north, that could have also happened at any point. And so my question is, why do we see that on one side, and why do we also see on another side that so many people are talking about the amazing cooperation from Mexico? There just seems to be a bit of a gap in the messaging. And where do you think that that's coming from? Do you think that maybe that's an effort to kind of elevate the Mexican government in public so that they will comply with some of our requests in private? I know you don't know, but I'm inviting you to speculate.
I do know a little bit on this one, but I think for purposes of public consumption, what I will say is that there is a long tradition, particularly around the U.S. Department of State, of unwarranted praise for bad actors, and that tradition continues.
I think that's accurate. Yeah. Well, we will see what happens. It's going to be a very interesting year. We have actually less than a year before USMCA is renegotiated, and the Americans hold all of the power. We have all the cards. And so it will be interesting to see what happens in that renegotiation, what the U.S. demands. Obviously, we've realized we can't rely on Mexico to control our border. They are not good faith partners to the U.S. And so I hope that we can use that as leverage as we go into the renegotiations.
I should certainly hope so. One of many hemispheric problems that we have to pay attention to and address. Fortunately, though, we have a White House that's willing to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very different times than the last time we used to record, Josh. But thank you for being on today. We ran out of time, but I know we still have a lot to talk about, so we will be back. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Melissa.